everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on climate foreign direct investment. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David Smith. Climate foreign direct investment is very important for emerging economies, specifically for India, for Bangladesh, for Pakistan, for Malaysia. So hopefully from today's sessions we can learn many interesting things and we can take initiative based on today's discussion. So David Smith, what you want to discuss for today's session? This is very vital, very important session.
Sharif, thank you for the opportunity to do this. The whole area of climate and providing investment funds to deal with it is an important one, not just for the region of the world you were talking about, but globally as well, in both developing and developed nations as well. It's a pretty well-known fact that large volumes of climate finance is needed, and it's needed pretty urgently. At the United Nations COPs 27, the governments that were there estimated that about $4 to $6 trillion are needed per year to for a global transformation to begin to move to a low carbon based economy, not a zero carbon base, but to a low carbon base. So about $6 trillion a year, and developing nations, like you mentioned, alone require about 5.8 trillion to implement their 2030 climate commitments. And so you can see they're a fairly significant part of that overall $6 trillion a year that is required to meet the COP27 targets. And many of the developing nations, including the ones you mentioned, Sri, are facing growing climate impacts, and they really need to raise some funds so that they can up their adoption rates of it. And the whole idea of foreign direct investments will have a role in meeting these needs. And otherwise, what direct foreign investments do, they are funds which are aligned with and support the climate change goals. And unfortunately, though, if you look globally, the FDIs, the foreign direct investment flow, is currently below what their potential is in being met in many of these developing and countries and getting the monies in to implement the changes you referenced, Sharif. And that can be for many different reasons. It could be some of the concerns that are linked to investment concerns of just the overall economy in the country or region. It could be the threat of conflict around the area. It could be past experience of funds that were spent from NGOs and others in that area. It could be the long-term nature or the capital intensiveness of it, because many of these climate change initiatives are very capital intensive, and many of them have very long-term horizons for return on investment. And all of those are things which challenge investors, and particularly when you look at foreign direct investment. Even though the purposes are great there, the ability to come in and handle those are sometimes real challenges. And while these investments are appropriate, there's many different places you can go and receive funding. So direct foreign investments really help meet the needs of the host state, helping them meet their climate goals. And because of the way direct foreign investment works, the governments, the NGOs, those implement it, can give equal consideration, not just to the environmental, but the social and economic and ecosystem concerns that are in the region that they're in, and how that can be applied. And they really, the direct foreign investments stand at the forefront of the battle against climate change. And the fact that when you look at the money that is coming out of the COP27, the COP28, that can be applied to deal with climate change, the really the source of the real flexible money that can be done is the FDI that are explicitly targeting climate because of the strong focus of the people who are providing the money of meeting that social good. And it really is really a social good there. And this crisis is real there, and this is one of the ways that you can begin to do that. There's some side benefits of the FDIs too. Climate FDIs could really help entrepreneurs, science, and industries develop new technology, and it could be a catalyst for that. And it helps the people who are the investors in the FDIs, in many instances, have a direct interaction with the people receiving the money and provide assistance and support going back and forth into it. And really, it's not just a climate change type of funding. It's actually one that can overall help increase the economic development potential within the region, and can be used to further enhance their ability to have the economy adapt to support the sustainability targets that are being put in place there. Sorry, a second. The other thing is you begin to look at FDIs. You see it used even as responses to some of the natural disasters and others that are a consequence of climate change. And with that, there have been places where countries and direct individuals and others are increasingly looking at the more exposures to water stress, floods, hurricanes, typhoons around the world. And this source of direct foreign investment has been shown to be very effective in dealing with those. It also, though, needs to look at how to be effective with increasingly shifting the focus away from the sources that cause the climate change, that cause the pollution, that cause the changes, and not just the effects of them. So you have to understand both the causes and effects. And we've seen over the last couple of years, there's an increasing impact on the physical world from the climate change, and how can you begin to deal with it and put the places into place with it. Find it here. One of the places you really need to begin to look a lot more is the World Economic Forum actually came out with a whole study of looking into FDIs, and one of their findings is that one of the priorities for FDIs and what they call the climate justice agenda must be to increase substantially the funding for green development in emerging markets and developing economies. And that they came to the conclusion that the foreign direct investments is the most important segment of all the money sources for these much needed private capital flows. And some of the early movers into it, the World Economic Forum is actually seeing some results coming back, and some of it possibly because the investors become more hands-on. They become more operative. They, in many instances, help even manage some of the projects that they are helping fund in working with the developing nations to meet the needs. And like I said earlier, investments in the trillions are still needed to go forward through these. And we'll see how that begins to work. But, it's still the early days after this commitment started. And we're looking to see how the developing markets respond to this new foreign divestment money coming in, because it has grown substantially over the years since it's been introduced. It has had a compound annual growth rate of new funding and cumulative funding coming in of about 16% per year. The pandemic pulled that back significantly, but it has rebounded really well in 2022 and in 2023. And the statistics of foreign direct investment that interested me a lot was the last source I could see was 2022, where about 52% of the direct foreign investment went to developed countries, and about 48% of that went to developing countries. So I'm going to call that close enough to say it's about 50-50. And it shows that the climate change, the climate remediation, the funding activities around it is about split between the developing and the developing nation. And but the funding has tripled in the last 10 years, which is really good as you look at what the outcomes of this can be. A couple more minutes. In developed countries, they have really, the FDIs have supplemented pools of domestic capital. For example, in the United States, under the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, direct foreign investment and the local funds have been in there. But, if you look at the developing nations, they're actively funded, but few have really received a very significant share of the funding. And underperformance is one of the reasons that the developing world is having a challenge. For example, according to some of the World Economic Forum's forecasts and reports, many of the developing countries have not mobilized the money they received that they were pledged to receive and begin to receive back in 2009 through all the way 2023 here. And that when you allocate money, even with direct foreign investments where the investors are not heavily involved, sometimes the money doesn't end up getting spent. And that is one of the challenges, Sharif, that I think, to go to one part of your original questions on this one, is why parts of the world do have challenges with attracting new funding in this area, is because of past performance and what's there. The other thing is you begin to look at some of the countries they're going in, some of the areas, and just like you and I have a credit rating, nations, sovereigns have what's called a sovereign credit rating. And those have impacted many nations' ability to attract significant foreign direct investment, is because of their past and their credit ratings. Just like, Sharif, your and my credit ratings, if they are bad, if we miss obligations and things, we have lower credit ratings, which makes it harder for us to receive investment, for us to receive loans and stuff as well. So the climate foreign direct investments are really no different than that as you look at them as an overall piece of it. Well, I've gone, wow, about 15 minutes. Let me pause and Sharif, see where you want me to take this if you have questions. You're muted. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for very interesting dialogues, and this is very important for our entrepreneurs. And recently, we are observing because of this uh, economical recession and the problem, country like Bangladesh, our banks credit rating or bank rating also decreasing. In that situations, how we can improve the banking system for climate finance, uh, how we can attract global investors for that particular issues.
Sharif, that's an excellent question. And it's actually a hard question. Just like, again, if you and I have a requirement to improve our credit scores personally, if a company does, if a nation does, the processes are all pretty similar. What countries have a real advantage of is there's enough NGO and NGO driven funds uh, where the due diligence is not as high as a foreign direct investment, where they can get a start of improving their uh, processes, capabilities, scores, and performance. The World Bank, the International Development Bank, USAID, some of the United Nations funds, if they're in Europe, some of the EU funds, some of the Asian Development Bank funds, all can be used if they qualify to help increase their scores. In many parts of the world, in parts of the world where I've been involved with some of the projects from the companies I work with and things, there is just a challenge with making sure that all the money is spent on projects. In one of the countries that I worked with, we were told up front that about half of the funds that went into the country would never make it to being applied on the project and on the what needed to get done because it was used to help pay for access, to help pay for many different things. It's just like part of the commentary today on why Russia systems are not performing as well in their conflict with Ukraine, the war with Ukraine. It's because a lot of the money that was supposed to go to modernize them, to build new capabilities, to use advanced materials, in fact, went into the pockets of some of the leaders, owners of those companies, and never made into products. That's one of the challenges you look at answering your question, Sri, is that traditionally in many countries, that number one, money, not the full amount of money has been used. Number two, where it was used, the processes for, say, manufacturing, the processes for services, the processes for other things were so heavily laden on having to pay additional money to get things done. It was really difficult to do that. I have a story on that that's kind of relates. I was doing a project years ago in Brazil, and we were trying to put a couple of E1 lines into a facility for broadband teleconferencing. And we ordered them. The installer came out to install it. He got there and he said, you can pay me 500 reals and I'll do the work today. If you don't pay me 500 reals, I'll come back and do the work in a month. And that is something that I've seen in both developing and developed nations everywhere. This particular one happened to be in a developed nation, but is comparable with others. So what's hard for banks in regions is that they tend to be responsible not just for what they do inside the bank, but what is done by the people outside the bank who are using these funds. And in some ways, that's unfair. But on the other hand, it also really helps with cultural change within the region. And banks very often are a flashpoint, a central point for helping enact that type of cultural change, that type of ecosystem changes, those type of economic development changes, because all of those take funds to compete. And of course, banks are one of the main sources of funds in any country. Dr. Sharif, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Research and innovation is very important for climate solutions. So, if the emerging economy, their university, their research lab produce different kind of solution, do you believe we can attract more FDI, or what is the ecosystem of a startup? What you want to share?
But I do believe that that can help you attract more funding from many different sources and not just FDI funds. Um, there is a great example of that that I've seen in that a source of hybrid mixed funds might be very interesting to help with ones like this. There was a climate change initiative uh, that's not far from here in Texas, in one of the regions of the world I love to travel to, and that is in the Caribbean. And there, and Barbados, there was an initiative to deal with climate changing, which is called the Bridgetown Initiative. And it was backed by the Prime Minister, the legislature there, and it was even backed by the French president as well. And it was trying to look in the country on how to do a comprehensive overhaul of the multilateral systems, the complex web of systems that were in place with there. And part of what their findings was that it really was a very complex system. You've heard me talk, Sharif, about a system of systems. A lot addressing things like this often involves a systems approach, and not many people understand that. So part of the outcome from the analysis done against the Bridgetown Initiative is that the challenge is facing how do I navigate all these various stakeholders with very huge competing care abouts, that they're really a highly variable collections, and that there was no single lever, no single point that could help meet all of these going together, and for them to start introducing change. Now, you know, you have to start with the setting the climate change goals, both ones that can be met near term, as well as the longer term, harder ones that will be met further out. Um, how do you support them with not just the investment, but how do you support them with putting the project management tools in place, the infrastructure in place that can help manage them, that can take measures against them? What are the KPIs? What are the things? And how do you, what the Bridgetown project showed, is you also have to put regulations in place that are transparent, that are predictable, and that are stable. Sharif, in the past on your program, many of the panelists and I and others have talked about how not necessarily using blockchain, but using the distributed ledger technology that blockchain is built upon. And in this instance, with some of the climate foreign direct investments, using blockchain technology as an enabler for that transparency, for that ability to track the funds and things is where many of the private investors are beginning to go, as you put to that. And the other place, particularly for the developing nations you were talking about, Sharif, oftentimes if they develop the technologies, if they develop the processes, and even the services, uh, these are things that can be exported to other countries around the world and can serve as a source of economic development for them, of entrepreneurial excellence, of science excellence as you begin to look at it. And they really, with the direct foreign investment, having people with a passion, the investors with a passion in this area, it could really help you begin to look at how do I plan to take not just the one event, not just the one thing we're doing, but how can I use it to build future capabilities that would let your country, your region, climb the value chain. It could boost the low carbon domestic industries, and it could add really quality jobs in each of the countries. And yes, there's a lot of diversity of work that can be done, from things to take the uh, climate change, take the hydrogen, the carbon, other things out of the air. Uh, how do you do new green hydrogen projects? Uh, how do you look at planning to use future capabilities to climb that new food chain? But there's much work ahead. Mitigation projects, uh, fixing the harm that was done in the past, are simple ones that many times have to be taken. Sharif, you did a project earlier in the year on the mangroves and things. The remediation of those directly helps with the climate change initiatives. So that's an example. You see renewable power. You're seeing new systems for controlling all of those. You're seeing ways to combat the fact that we are losing our forest at an alarming rate. Uh, we're seeing raising water on some of the coast, and how can I begin to mitigate the impacts of that? And unfortunately, fortunately, these climate value chains are distributed value changes, and they're usually distributed on a global basis, which makes them more complex and harder to establish initially and harder to manage. But mastering those skills for dealing with climate foreign direct investments is valuable, not only for the environmental reasons, like I said before, but for fostering communities, creating those future jobs, creating that economic development boom, and for increasing the science and technology capabilities of the nations, which I believe is a very important one, in the area of the countries and the targets that you mentioned. That part of the world, the countries you mentioned, are striving to become more innovative as it is. Just you are leading very large incubators, and there's large accelerators in that region too. There's increasing money being put into science uh, in the countries you mentioned to uh, accelerate the processes. And it's being done in a way that the Technopolis concept, which I also talk very often about, can be used to pull all those stakeholders together, which is necessary to have an effective action in this area. Uh, and that's I think that's the part of the answer to your question there, Sharif.
Thank you. I think Mr. Daniel has one questions.
What are the possibilities of using different types of cryptocurrency? Daniel, great question. And, you know, cryptocurrency as an exchange has good applicability if the they can be converted into the cash of the nation which is having the projects conducted in. I can tell you it's interesting in my home community here, in that in Austin, some of the early leaders of cryptocurrencies were in this area because Austin is a technology hub. But um, it's really hard to pay for services. I cannot go and get a construction firm to build a building and pay them in cryptocurrency. It's really hard for me to order pumps and solar cells and uh, wind generators, water hydroelectric generators with using a cryptocurrency today. So in parts of the world, there are more, some other parts of the world, they're more accepting of some of the cryptocurrencies. So that's an answer to your question, Daniel, that is really dependent on the country you're talking about and the commercial viability of the companies within that region to accept crypto. Crypto is an emerging trend. It's here. Do I think it's going to get large enough to replace national uh, monetary policy and national banks? Probably not. But interesting, I am seeing some large banks begin to have the ability to handle crypto funds differently than sovereign funds. And maybe slowly we'll get to a day where that type of widespread commitments to building and doing things are appropriate there. But today it's still a fairly heavy lift for most of the people who are receiving the funds from a climate-based foreign direct investment are from NGO based investment trying to deal with foreign change to be able to convert those into work to perform. So Daniel, I know that's a tough answer, a long answer, but could it work? Yes. The problem is it does not have part of the infrastructure for getting the full range of services capabilities needed to have meaningful impact in this area yet. So Sharif, I hope that answered Daniel's question.
Yes, thank you. Climate change oriented education is very important. How we can educate more people for climate change, and we can do more advocacy or awareness to the grassroots level people.
Uh, Education in climate change is very, very important. Uh, if you begin to look at it, you're seeing the fact that education is necessary, not just for the people working on the solutions, not just for the governments dealing with it, not just for the companies, but that type of education is very important for the citizens as well. Tremendously more to the citizens as well. What is good with direct foreign investment in this area is by working with the local individuals, uh, you are turning some of the disadvantages into advantages of that money flow, and find that you can begin to put those places into place. Also, Education is important with understanding the ecosystem's differences, but you have to be able to really turn the tide on how to do that education, uh, and how to put in place. And climate change, climate crisis are really very connected at the hip. For example, that climate changes and the impact of all of these is disrupting the current education even. One of the World Economic Forum says over 40 million children's educations are directed and interrupted because of climate change action. And that is really, you also need to understand in the education process, what are the direct effects of climate change and what are the indirect effects? You're seeing some of them in that the temperatures are rising. We're seeing more extreme climate action, more very cold, more very hot. We're seeing water shortages. We're seeing flooding that had not been there. We're seeing that the learning environments themselves are suffering as well. On some of the indirect effects that education has is an impact of, we're also seeing that the mental health, the social emotional learning, has decreased in areas where there is climate challenges. You see reduced physical health, reduced mental health. You're seeing the fact that population movements have become greater because not only increased migration, but also displacement. And these cause gender inequalities, they cause conflict, they cause more poverty in places. But education is the power, it is the element that can really empower these, particularly the lower income communities, to adapt to some of the worst impacts of the climate change and the biodiversity loss, and how to improve resiliency, because that's part of it. I can, in areas that do not have enough rain today, that had it in the past, how do you encourage the farmers to change the type of crops they're planting? How do you, even for the same crop, encourage them to go to seeds that are less water needy? And this needs to be a two-way change between the people who are producing and providing the education and the people, the scientists, the politicians, and others who understand the climate and environmental details of the crisis that we're in, of how the change processes could work. And so you begin to see, how do I not only change the education, but how do I, again, like I said before, improve the resiliency, the ability to adapt and mitigate, and make the changes necessary to do these in many different ways. So education needs to address the direct effects. How do I do the learning? How can I put new cognitive skills in place, new problem solving skills in place? One of the things that we're seeing today, because the world is digital and it's connected, is we're seeing more and more sensors, more of the Internet of Things coming into play. How do I help educate the people who are trying to apply these direct foreign investments into a better way? How can how can I teach risk? And again, the indirect sides of education in this area, Sri, you know, uh, as you begin to do the education things we've talked about, you're providing more access to information, not just for the people being trained, but for the community as whole. And that should result in also poverty reduction and open up economic and social capital that can go forward and be part of that. And education is so necessary. you have to increase the human capital uh, to let people raise their expertise uh, in the whole climate area and climate technologies and climate policy and interaction on all of the rules and regulations there. And really, climate change is one where it is a time, again, you've heard me talk about this a lot, of lifelong learning. It's not that you can go take a class or a series of class and be successful. You have to continue this ongoing. We're seeing new science, we're seeing new approaches, we're seeing new best practices, new regulatory approaches come out all the time. You have to stay up to date on those. And education is the key for doing that, Sharif. Oh, and thank you, Daniel, for your comment.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. If you discuss more about the learning procedure, like how we can attract more I think emerging economy basically they struggle a lot for this FDI and this kind of thing. What is your advice, and what is your final comments for today's session?
Um, you see a lot of innovative approaches being done, and so part of that is figuring out how to pull them into what it is you're doing. Uh, and this type of education, this type of training is going to really help you understand the $1 trillion gaps that are being put there. And um, the playbook, that roadmap, the areas that need to be helped so that you can see solutions. You know, the way to transition to low carbon, in particularly low tech, mid to high tech, is one that there's so many individual concerns with it. And that education is a really important part of that. And you need to help policy makers, financial risk management decision makers, excuse me, all understand that there needs to be a new framework put in place for assessing, doing due diligence, tracking, managing the whole approach to direct foreign investments for climate change, just like you see it in many other ways. And the other piece of education that's really required here, Dr. Shree, is how do you take advantage of the emerging technologies, the explosive growth of the Internet of Things to monitor climate change, to monitor forests, to monitor water quality, to look at ways to handle biodiversity and to be able to help break down and handle others. The ability to take and apply the new geospatial resources, the new satellites that are being launched that will give you data on this. We're beginning to see some common regulatory frameworks being proposed. How can the governments in the countries that you're talking about, Sri, come together and understand it's not just the framework, not just the things in their own country, but as we've spoken before, climate change is not something that you can do just in your backyard. It has to be your neighbors as well, and that it needs to be able to work as a part of the um, greater geographic capabilities of the area. And, we're going to see all new types of funding coming out, and direct foreign investments, as many different say, is going to dramatically increase the options and the complexity of being effective during those times. So it's really, the whole education piece is important. The ability to become more transparent, to put banking institutions in place, the ability to bring together the whole areas of the Technopolis, the commercial sector, small and large, the academic capabilities from research universities and colleges to trade schools to boot camps and others. Really important to pull those resources together. Government. Government plays a huge part in this, as well as the private citizens. So it is key and critical to pull all of those elements of the Technopolis together to better leverage any climate-based foreign direct investment, any climate-based funding from an NGO, or any climate-based funding that can be worked around the different areas. And that is key to really solving this problem and being able to have meaningful results to try to meet those climate targets out of COP27. So Sharif, I think that uh, answers your question.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. This is very interesting discussions, and hopefully through this process, our people can learn a lot more things. Thank you. Bye bye, and take care.
You take care. Thank you.